Elias Thorne stood before the Kurzil High Command, his fingers smudged with charcoal and his posture remarkably casual. He did not point at the tactical lattice or the looming Star Eater. Instead, he tapped a crude drawing of a wedding arch. "This is the gravity well," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "This is where we break their momentum and chisel their pride into dust. Humans are often dismissed as simple creatures, but what if their simplicity is their greatest weapon?" Subscribe to join our chronicle of the unexpected. Let's return to the day the stars began to churn. That same smell of scorched ozone and synthetic jasmine. It had first filled Vexura's vents 3 weeks earlier, when she stood on the docking bay of Echo Point Zenith, waiting for her primitive groom. Vexura adjusted the heavy silks of her formal attire, her chitin plates clicking in a restless rhythm, a sound like dry leaves in a storm. The Soul-Dust mail was late. She had expected a scarred warrior, some savage general meant to seal the blood pact between their dying empires. Instead, a man appeared who looked like he had recently stepped out of a planetary furrow. He wore a plain cotton shirt, stained at the cuffs with what looked like actual soil. He was so plain. Elias Thorne did not bow with the sweeping grace of the Kurzil. He offered a short, awkward tilt of the head. In his hand, he gripped a tattered charcoal sketchpad, the edges frayed and grayed by frequent use. As the High Exarch's advisors whispered about trade logistics and resource chasms, Elias did not look at the holographic maps. He sat on a low bench and began to work. The rhythmic scratching of a pencil on coarse paper filled the silence of the diplomatic suite. It was a small, persistent sound that seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. Vexura watched him. He was not calculating the yield of the Ethelgard mines or the strength of the Void Reaper vanguard. He was drawing a frostbloom he had seen in the station's hydroponic garden. Beneath the observation deck, something shifted. A low hum, then nothing. A vibration rumbled through the floor, signaling the arrival of a Void Reaper scouting party. Yet Elias did not flinch. He merely shifted his grip on the pencil, his thumb smudged dark with charcoal. To the Kurzil High Command, he was nothing more than diplomatic chaff, a necessary sacrifice to secure the borders. They spoke above him as if he were a piece of furniture, discussing the inevitable collapse of their outer defenses. The general hissed, his scent pits flaring with the acrid stench of fear. He noted that the Reapers were moving through the Ethelgard sector and that there was no way to intercept them without losing the primary gravity well. Elias looked up then. It was the first time his gaze had truly locked onto the tactical display. He did not look at the troop numbers. He looked at the empty spaces between the stars. And then he smiled. It was not a smile of arrogance, but one of recognition, like a gardener seeing the first sprout of spring. He stood and walked toward Vexura, his movements lacking any military precision. He held out the blue-petal frostbloom he had been sketching. "It is a beautiful flower," he said, his voice quiet, "but if you plant it in the wrong soil, it dies. Logistics is just knowing where things belong so they can grow." As the silence of the station deepened, Vexura began to wonder if the Kurzil had made a fatal mistake. Join us as we uncover the secrets hidden in Elias's sketches. The general scoffed, his mandibles clicking in derision, but Vexura noticed something. Elias was not looking at the flower anymore. He was looking at the way the light from the nebula caught the edges of the tactical holographic display. He reached out, his charcoal-smudged finger tracing a path through the red zone territory that no Kurzil pilot would dare enter. A graveyard of 1,000 ships. "There is a pattern here," Elias murmured. "The way the light from the nebula is beginning to churn against the station's shielding. It is not chaos. It is an opportunity." He began to sketch again, faster now, his pencil moving with a frantic, purposeful energy. He was not drawing flowers anymore. Vexura watched the tactical lattice bleed into a deep, bruised crimson. Ethelgard was dying. The Star Eater, a moon-sized horror of black iron and cold fire, was only minutes from crossing the inner rim. The Kurzil generals roared for a final, suicidal charge, their mandibles clashing in a desperate symphony of extinction. Amidst the chaos, Elias Thorne stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a loose thread hanging from his plain sleeve. "Think of the Void Reapers like a mountain flood," Elias said, his voice cutting through the panic with an eerie, rhythmic calm. "Everyone is trying to build a wall to stop the water, but walls always break when the pressure gets high enough. Space is not an empty chasm. It is a stream of gravity. If we place our ships like rocks in the right curves, we do not need to fight the momentum. We just make it flow into the mouth of the storm." He pointed to his sketch of the garden, where the blue petal frostbloom sat at the center of a swirling pattern. "Gravity is the soil. You do not fight it. You plant your intent within it and wait for the harvest." The High Exarch looked at the soul dust mail, then at the impossible geometry on the screen. The plan required 3,000 ships to fire their engines in a sequence that made no tactical sense. It was a logistical nightmare that ignored every law of Kurzul warfare. Shouldn't have, but it worked. When the thousands of Kurzul and soul dust vessels ignited their pulse drives in a synchronized sequence that defied every established doctrine of the Imperial War College, the sheer concentrated mass